Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, and I serve as the host of the program. I'm a professor of sociology at Western Michigan University. Joining me today is one of our regular Critical Issues commentators, Denise Keele. Denise wears many hats. She's a professor of political science at Western Michigan University. She is also affiliated with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And Denise also chairs the Western Michigan University Working Group on Climate Change. So, Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year, Denise.
Happy New Year. It's great to be back.
Starting off 2018.
Yes.
And as we've done in this program a number of times, it's sort of a nice thing to look back at the previous year, review the many different events.
There's a lot to look back on.
There was a lot going on, a lot of critical issues.
Yeah.
And then to kind of look ahead to what's going to happen in the coming year, maybe do a few predictions, if we're so bold as to venture predictions. So now, certainly 2017, you can't avoid it. It was the year of the Trump presidency, right? Donald Trump was inaugurated in January of 2017, and it's been a wild roller coaster ride ever since then in terms of various policies and crises, investigations, one thing after another, it seems. In fact, sometimes when we talk about what we're going to discuss on this program, the next time we meet, we say, well, let's have to wait and see what the latest thing that's happening in Trump world. So I think to some extent, as I look back on 2017, it was worse than I feared. I mean, I thought it was going to be bad, but it seemed to me to be even worse than I had anticipated. And to some extent, I really feel like we are in an existential crisis right now. I really feel like we are in a deep, deep political crisis in this country, and it's a very dangerous time. And, 2018, I think, is going to be one of those significant years. This is the 50th anniversary of 1968, which, of course, all kinds of, major watershed events took place in that year. And I kind of have a feeling that 2018 might be the same way. So what's your take on
He's already making predictions then. So
I am. I already made one. So what's your take on 2017?
I don't disagree. I think 2017 ended up being one of the longest, toughest years, in part because I think politically most of us, the year actually started right after the election. Right? So it was like an extra couple months of depression and sadness before terrible things actually did start to happen. And we saw many of our norms crumble. We saw some of the worst acts that human beings can do to each other sanctioned and perpetrated by our own government. So on the other hand, there's a little glimmer of hope. There was also huge protest movements all year, as I know that you keep up on, which I think is leading up to this wave of change. And I think this is one of these moments. 2018 right now shows all signs of being a watershed moment of a direction in at least U.S. politics.
Yeah, I think one of the stories of 2017 was the resistance that developed. Certainly as soon as Trump was elected, there were all kinds of different movements and constituencies that began to mobilize to say they anticipated what was going to happen with this new administration, and they decided that we had to really get organized to resist right from the get-go. So right off the bat, there was the huge women's march in D.C.
That's right.
And there were marches locally as well, all around the country. There was the important climate change march in April. And the climate movement has definitely had to mobilize in a way perhaps that it's never had to before to resist what's really happening is a lot of reversals of things that we thought had been accomplished and now are being undone. The Black Lives movement, I think, had intensified also. And so just on numerous fronts, the indivisible movement, I think, should have perhaps some special notice because they put out a pamphlet to kind of instruct people how you can carry out resistance within Congress, how you can play the game of electoral politics and try to resist the bad things that were coming down the pike in Congress. So I do think, yes, first off the bat, it was a year of resistance on many fronts.
Yeah, I mean, depending on whose numbers you believe, right? We've also had a year of alternative facts. The last quote I read, though, that the largest single day of protest in the United States, the amount of people, was the day after the inauguration. Right now, if you believe Trump, more people came to his inauguration than ever before, but actually recorded the largest single day of protest was in reaction to the presidency rather than those in support of that. So I think that is a huge story. That's this idea of, so again, if I go back to my political science, right, why did we create these structures and institutions the way that we did? You know, and if we really want to go back to the founding fathers, we were pretty afraid of tyranny of the majority. We were pretty afraid of a demagogue. That's, you know, why these systems were put in place, and we're experiencing tyranny of the majority right now, right? With 51 votes in the Senate, you can do whatever you want because that supposedly gives you a mandate, right? And the fear has always been that's why we don't have direct democracy, we have representative democracy, that if you let a simple majority rule, you would ignore and exploit minority interests and minority groups. And I feel like it's just all playing out right in front of us. The exact things we tried to avoid are being dismantled in order to have tyranny of this very slim majority in Congress right now.
The Trump administration has been very corrosive of the political process. I think that's what you're saying here.
Yes.
It certainly didn't start with Trump.
No, that's very true.
So I think it's important to point out that the Republican Party has become a party of extremism. And that was true even before Trump. What makes this so dangerous is now, given the fact that the presidency is also in the hands of the Republicans, that because they control the Congress now, they can attempt to ram through.
That's right.
They tried with regard to repealing the health care law.
Yes, exactly.
They really had no replacement. So repeal and replace was really a misnomer. It was entirely an attempt to repeal, to turn back the Affordable Care Act. They were successful, of cose, with the tax scam, as
and with the Supreme Court. Gorsuch nomination, that had never been done before in American politics, to break that rule of 60 and go to a simple majority to approve a Supreme Court justice.
So there are a number of political norms that govern how the Congress should operate, how the American political system should operate.
That's right.
And so what we've seen with the Trump presidency is that those norms are eroding quite quickly. And because the Republican Party itself has become such an extremist party, that's quickening the pace at which these norms can now be eroded. I mean, let's just take the tax scam bill. I'll let you talk about that here. But to me, this is not the way the Senate operates. This is not the way the Congress operates. They held no hearings.
That's right.
They allowed no amendments. They had the majority. They operated as quickly as they possibly could. They rammed it through.
That's right.
And that just isn't the way. I mean, they kept saying, well, how about the Affordable Care Act when the Democrats pushed that through under Obama? But they had hundreds of hearings. Allowed amendments.
That's
it was a long, drawn-out process. There was a lot of heated political debate. Obviously, the Republicans objected to it.
That's right.
But it wasn't rammed down everybody's throat in a matter of couple of weeks.
That's right. Exactly. No, we're seeing the effects of partisan politics at its worst. And you're absolutely right to point out that this has been something that's been building for the last probably 20 years. You know, most political scientists would go back to Reagan to start to identify when the two-party partisanship really begins, and we're still sort of singing the same rhetoric. Both parties are there, and now the latest Pew and Gallup polls, Americans are more divided than ever. I think we're at 22 points. Under Reagan, it was like an 8-point difference between a true liberal and a true conservative. Up to like 22-point difference now. Folks are much more divided, and you're absolutely right. 2013 was the first year under the Democrats that these rules and Senate norms about how we could vote on things were changed, and the Democrats changed that for executive appointment nominations and for lower court justice nominations. What the Republicans seek to do is to change that for legislation, like tax bill and the ACA, but they couldn't even get 51 votes for the ACA. That's how fragmented and extreme wings of their own party exist, and of course for the Supreme Court for Gorsuch. So that, to me, this partisanship is a huge, larger issue, and gerrymandering works into that, right? The idea of the winner take all. I got 51%, so therefore I can have this tyranny of the majority and only my policies matter and I don't have to talk to the other side. Those are corrosive elements that are not the norm and historical way that we've gone about business. And in 2013, of course, the Republicans said, oh, this process is, they're not playing by the rules. Well, we do get to write our own rules, and now the same thing is happening again. So of course, whatever party's in charge is going to try to make those rules come to their outcomes. But what we're lacking is what we would call deliberation and some consensus. Compromise has become a dirty word. We can't reach across the aisle anymore. It's a complete culture war. Would be how I would describe it, and we're just seeing the effects of that in our Congress.
And it wasn't always that way.
No.
I mean, in the post-World War II era, when we look from, say, let's say 1940 to 1960, I know political scientists talked about the convergence thesis and the idea of appealing to the median voter. Both parties were more moderate, I think, in their approaches.
Absolutely.
You had both a liberal and a conservative wing in both political parties at that time. Politics were very, very different at that point. But now, since the late 60s and accelerating under the Reagan era, we've had this greater, more extreme partisan polarization that's taken place. And that's happened with both parties, I think, to some extent. Although, to me, the story with the Democratic Party is that they've moved more to the right as opposed to moving more to the left.
I would agree with that.
The Republican Party has moved to an extreme position on the right. And I just want to quote these two political scientists you're probably very familiar with, the work of Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein. And they're well-known scholars of Congress. I think they're pretty well respected in the field. And this is what they concluded in their recent book. It's Worse Than It Looks. This is the title of the book. They concluded, the Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited social and economic policy regime, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understanding of facts, evidence, and science, dismissive of the legitimacy of its political opposition. And they go on to add that one of our two major political parties has become so radicalized that at critical times and on critical occasions it will not or cannot engage constructively in the governing process anticipated by our constitutional charter.
I think they sum it up pretty darn well. Yes.
I mean, that's sort of what we've just been talking about,
That's what we've been talking about. That's right.
Probably much better than we did, but...
The other thing that's changed from the post-war era and then through the Reagan administration is, of course, the number and influence of interest groups. So if we want to explain political behavior, we can say, we have a few theories in political science, right? It's all these interest groups, and it's true pluralism. All interest groups are created equal. Everybody has their say. We elect deliberative legislators to mete out the public interest, right? That's the good old days, right? Versus elitism, which most of my students would say that's what's happening now. It's a few governing the many, right? It's only the powerful Koch brothers or the very powerful Tom Steyer on the other side of the aisle who really are controlling things. But the electorate has changed, and in following those interest groups, right, folks have also become politically active only on those extreme margins. Our median voter doesn't go to the polls anymore.
It's going away,
They might still exist. It might be the, Nixon's famous, the silent majority that was really supporting everything out there. But we know from polling and from political activism that those who identify as extremely liberal or extremely conservative are also the most likely to donate to campaigns, the most likely to vote, the most likely to support political institutions. And so you see this partisanship, it's kind of, is it chicken or egg? Right? And once then you redistrict in a way that allows for even more extreme voters to elect their most extreme preferred candidate, you get this ultimate clash of culture and ideology that we're seeing.
To me, what this does is that it makes the primary elections critically important, more important than the general election. And the process for nominating the presidential candidates has also changed dramatically since about the early 1970s, where again, the primaries become much more important. Party elites sort of lost control of the process, which on the one hand seemed like a good democratic, good set of democratic reforms.
That's right,
But it allows the more ideologically extreme elements to control the primary process, and it forces candidates to appeal to the more extreme factions on both sides of their party, as opposed to that median voter that ruled in the 40s and 50s,
That's exactly right. The whole game now is to capitulate to the extreme end so you can rile up. There's always been that base, right, political base, but your job now is to get them as riled up and angry as possible. Well, that fear and anger work for motivation for short times in our lives as human beings, but it's not really a way to govern, right?
So this helps to explain Trump, and then I think the huge other card here, of course, is the racial politics, because to some extent Trump played the racial politics very well during the primaries and in the general election. I mean, I think if we go back in history, we see with the civil rights movement, and there was certainly a white backlash against the civil rights movement, we're so deeply divided on a number of issues, but the racial politics have played a particularly important role here, and Trump was able to use those issues very well. And
I think it's been stunning to a lot of just ordinary Americans, as well as political scientists, even those that study race and identity, and maybe sociologists, how strong of an anti-racial, anti-religion, the concept of the other, how strong a vein that really still existed in America that could be tapped into and could be utilized for political means that way. I certainly was surprised, even having grown, I grew up in a very conservative Midwest farm, Iowa family girl, very lack of diversity, right? And so when I even talked to my relatives, you kind of knew a little bit of that was still there, but I was really surprised. I think the nation was really surprised that that could be tapped into in such a way, and there was such support for a candidate who unequivocally played on those exact emotions. Immigration, the whole Charlottesville, it's amazing
the white nationalist
that you can get away, again, these norms, you can get away with saying those things.
I mean, it was almost, you couldn't, it was almost inexplicable that Steve Bannon, Steve Bannon, given his record and his proud record of supporting the alternative right and white nationalist movement, would be allowed to participate in a mainstream political campaign. Let alone to be given a place in the White House. Now, of course, recently Trump and Bannon have had their fallout. We may want to get to that in a moment, a very public divorce going on there.
That's right.
But the fact that a person like Bannon could be allowed to participate in the campaign and occupy a prominent policy position in the White House would have been unthinkable.
That's right.
20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Even 8 years ago, I would think, right? Well, that's what's so interesting. I think that we can look at Trump not as sort of his own creation, right? This is a lot of factors coming together that created Trump, and now it's just given the spotlight and the ability for all those things that have sort of been there, creeping around the edges to get them out in the open. So how we deal with them, that's why I think this year of protests, the 2018 midterm elections coming up, are going to be a huge bailiwick of what is the pulse, really. Because now we've let this sort of snake in the garden have its day. We've got all those fears out. How do we really respond to those as a country? So
yeah.
Yeah.
So we've been talking more in terms of Trump and the campaign issues and the Congress and the way things have operated at that level. But to me, one of the big stories of the year, and perhaps one of the most overlooked stories of the year, was the Trump cabinet appointments.
Yes.
Because this turns out to be even more critical. I mean,
that's right.
If we look at Trump in terms of legislative accomplishments, really the tax bill that they ran through is the only legislative accomplishment to speak of. Now, they did get Gorsuch nominated and approved at the Supreme Court.
Right.
But to me, the biggest story is the cabinet appointments. And we can just go down the list. Scott Pruitt at the EPA, of course, is the one you and I, given our interest in environmental politics, are most concerned with. But across the board, we've seen just real, I mean, basically people have been appointed to cabinet positions because they are opposed to the public mission of the office to which they've been appointed.
In order to dismantle it, right?
They've been brought in to dismantle the EPA and on and on and on.
That's right.
So to me, that's the biggest story. And of course, we follow the EPA more closely. But the fact that because of the climate change issue is an issue we're very concerned with. But Pruitt coming in and saying that the Clean Power Plan will be done away with, Trump announcing that the United States is going to withdraw from the Paris Accord, that was announced back in June. And on almost every kind of issue that we can point to, it's been a disastrous year for the environment. Now, the most recent thing just this week is that Trump has moved to open nearly all offshore waters to oil drilling.
That's right.
There's going to be enormous pushback against that by the West Coast states in particular. State of Florida, the Republican governor of Florida is not happy about this. I think the East Coast, has always been a very difficult proposition for the oil companies to carry out. So it might not lead to much in the way of actual drilling. But it sends just this huge message, right? That, hey, the extraction of fossil fuels, full steam ahead, give it the green light, despite the concerns of the climate movement, which says that most of those fossil fuels have to stay in the ground if we're to have any chance of holding global warming to the limits that the international political community has agreed to.
That's right.
And so just to take that one cabinet position, but this is a story that's been repeated across the board in almost every cabinet we can point to.
That's right. Rick Perry, Department of Energy, when he ran for president, he ran on abolishing that particular position. And like you said, those are then the exact people that now run them. So this, to me, is a story of there's a lot of power in the administrative agencies and within the executive branch because we have seen, again, over these last 20 years, a weakening of our ability to compromise due to this partisanship we've been talking about, right? So Congress, when it does write a law, it's more vague because I can get you to agree to it. And then that power is really passed on to those administrative agencies to kind of figure it out. And they serve at the pleasure of the president, right? So in the larger sense, this is Trump and the Republican Party playing right into the fears and those ideologies of the base Republican Party that says government is a bad thing. There's too much power. There's too much bureaucracy, right? We don't need all these rules that are protecting your health and safety and welfare, which is in the Constitution, right? And so that's really what they're going to be able to say that they did, and I think that's the way that plays in very red America, is to be able to say, well, we slashed the budget, we're not cleaning up those toxic sites, and that's a good thing, right? Because we've gotten rid of government control over individual life is still the rhetoric that is the sounding board for all those types of decisions. Whereas we could actually have an intelligent, perhaps rational debate about what powers agencies should have, and are there enough checks and balances within a representative democracy that do we need some more light shed on those? Right? That would be a conversation worth having rather than again, I'm in power, slash it all, versus I'm in power as a Democrat, let's go full steam on climate change and give them all the money in the world, right? Neither of those things is probably a great thing for a democracy.
And you would hope that that regulatory process operates on the basis of the best science possible, right?
That's what the law says.
An empirical analysis of the threats that are out there and how we can rationally and logically plan to respond to those threats to protect the health and safety of the American people.
Yes.
But again, the people that are being appointed to these cabinet positions simply don't believe in the science.
They do not, and they don't believe in that public process. You know, it's not only get rid of the government regulations and the agencies that are created to do that. It's sort of get rid of any transparency or public process associated with that decision making too. I mean, there are laws about exactly the things you say about the science and using facts, and there are also laws for public input into those processes. But then we're back to partisanship. Who comments on the new EPA rule? The two extreme sides, right? And again, this loss of a median voter or a public in order to be responsible and held responsible to. And that is my great hope for 2018, that we are seeing in these protest movements the beginning of a public voice on these matters again, which historically public opinion has always been huge in in electoral and legislative politics. And the fact that you can get away with and get elected and not do things that 75% of Americans support clean energy.
Yeah.
If you frame it that way, you say wind and solar. Yet we're not going to do that, right? 75% think that we should have health care. Probably more, right? All of these things, there is a true public opinion on, but we haven't flexed that muscle and that voice in a while to sort of rein in that system. The only other check on the bureaucracy is the courts. So, and which is what most of my time is spent studying. So we definitely see an uptick in lawsuits during Republican administrations for exactly these reasons, because they are less likely to kind of follow that public process, transparency, and there are a lot more lawsuits on, well, you're actually using the science in your decision making. So we'll end up in the courts, right? Trump administration has nominated and confirmed more lower court judicial appointees than any other administration in recent memory. Many of them considered unqualified by the American Bar Association.
Ideologically extreme,
That's exactly
but
right.
Also just basically unqualified.
That's exactly right.
I mean, there have been some extremely embarrassing moments where the candidates that have been nominated know almost nothing about the law, have no experience, they've never tried a case.
That's right.
And yet here they are being proposed to be a federal district court judge.
Exactly. So to me, right, these under the scenes, I agree with you, it's the agency regulations, those cabinet appointments that are so much power that you can just devolve right there. But then all these court nominations, which will last a very, very long time. And if that's your only check against deregulation, right, one of the easiest ways is to take the agency to court. Now you've got a justice who might not care either, or not even know the law.
To know the law in the first place.
My students could have answered more questions than the poor guy who eventually recused himself out of his own embarrassment, I think.
That was just incredible. I mean,
that was,
Well, and here's the other issue, is that the only constituency that has a voice is the corporate world.
That's right.
The business world. I mean, all these Trump cabinet appointees have very, very close ties and connections to the corporate world.
That's right.
Pruitt, of course, to the oil and gas industry. And across the board, it's the corporate interests that have the say. They're the ones that write the legislation. They're the ones that have the ear. They're the ones that get the meetings, right? The public is effectively shut out of the process, but the corporate interests are allowed to prevail. And so this is, I know you political scientists talk about regulatory capture.
That's right.
This is regulatory capture
Agency
in the
capture
extreme.
at its worst. That's right. It's an interesting thing with the corporate, because if you really do look back again, I think we're starting to look at these last 20 years differently as sort of this ebb towards creating the space for this year of Trump. And one of the other things you can look back and say that we did was over these last 20 years is increase corporate power.
Right.
Citizens United would be one of the best examples of the dark money that's available in politics now. And there are a lot of other similar legislation and tax bills, right? That really all we've done is advance that interest rather than try to continue to rein it in or build up this supposed public interest, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can think about this as a huge flood that's been building
exactly
and straining the dam, but the election of Trump represents the breaking of the dam, and now these corporate interests are, you know, flooding us and taking over, and there's really no more ability to have any kind of checks or balances on corporate power.
That's right.
Of course, there's another word for that, isn't it? Fascism.
Fascism. That's
right. The actual word.
That's right.
The other major issue, I think, in 2017 having to do with Trump, and again, it didn't start with Trump, but I think it gets magnified.
Yeah.
And that is that we are now in the age of unreason.
Yes.
We are now in an age where political discourse has completely broken down, where alternative facts are allowed, science is denied, lies are told on a regular basis. The Washington Post has been keeping a list.
Yeah.
They have been documenting, and they're pretty cautious. I mean,
and this is the Post, so you know, it's
the
not
Washington
like
Post.
the New York Times or some liberal, you know.
Yeah. It's but they have pointed out that President Trump has made 1,950 false or misleading claims over the first 347 days of his administration. And, you know, how can we govern ourselves? How can we have a democracy if lies are told on such a regular and shameless basis?
That's right.
The truth does matter.
That's right.
And there is a truth out there. There is an obdurate quality to the empirical world.
Yes.
And we see that not only, of course, with regard to the denial of climate science, but we see it in just almost every area of governance now, where lies reign.
Yes.
And lies are told so shamelessly, so blatantly.
That's right.
Take the tax scam bill.
Yep.
I mean, the Republicans had to lie almost shamelessly and continuously to get that tax bill passed, right?
Yes.
And even so, despite all the lies, the vast majority of the public opposed the tax bill.
That's right.
They recognized that this was a complete corporate giveaway. This was a complete giveaway to the wealthy.
That's right.
That despite there was, you know, some crumbs in there for the middle class, those were set to expire in a few years. That mostly this was a complete giveaway. It was going to drive up the deficit by $1.5 trillion. Most people saw through the lies, but the lies were told on a regular basis. Trickle down. This will benefit. This will come to benefit everybody eventually. Well, we've been told that since the Reagan era.
That's exactly
There's absolutely no empirical
never worked
evidence.
out before.
It's never worked out. There's no empirical evidence to support that. But they keep telling this story, this false story, over and over again to justify tax breaks to the wealthiest individuals and corporations in the world.
Yeah, well, so I think that averages out to 6 lies a day. I'd like to see if we could get away with that, right? I think there are kind of two things, again, going on. One we've talked a lot about is this ability of tyranny of the majority. Even though 75% of the American public saw through that tax scam, didn't support this bill, doesn't matter. You can winner takes all, push it through, make it happen. But the second is this more insidious happening is that folks believe it. There are some folks that that's exactly what they want to hear, and that's that extreme side of the party that votes, gives them money, and supports the redistricting of that particular candidate. So they're singing their own little symphony together, and it's at the expense of the rest of the country and the American public, for sure. But there is that contingency that's what they want to hear, and they really believe that, you know.
As the partisan polarization grows greater, people only want to hear what supports their particular extreme partisan political view. And so that means they reject the science.
That's right.
Any rational analysis of the situation.
Yes.
If it differs from their political ideology.
Yeah, and I think to some extent that's sort of always been true. I mean, politics at its core is about values, and maybe not about the most rational response to problems, right? And we can see that on both sides of the aisle. as well. But again, we're in an extreme swing of the pendulum of the ability to say what's rational, what's reasonable, what does the evidence support, versus this is just what I want to hear. And you know, and this goes back to, really it was Bush v. Kerry where this became clear and was written about a lot in the political science world. You know, well, why did Kerry lose? A lot of people tried to analyze that. And he would get up and give these long, complex, nuanced answers to questions, right? People didn't want to hear all of that. They wanted to hear Bush say, it'll be all right. We'll take care of you.
Yeah.
Go to Walmart. And so there's lots of blame to go around, I think, right? The politicians are responding to the electorate, but the electorate has a job to do as well. We have rights, but we also have responsibilities. And what I see is folks trying to figure out what those responsibilities might be and what levers can they actually pull, because they don't like what's going on. And we do have a majority of people in this country who are on the same cultural path together, right? Tax bills and climate and all of these things.
Neil Postman nailed it, you know, 30 years ago, amusing ourselves to death, the change in political discourse as we move from a typographic culture to a screen culture.
To a screen culture.
And we become a more extreme screen culture, internet, social media culture.
The information age, right? We have access to more information than ever possible, but we limit ourselves to only that which
supports our political view.
That's right. Well, I challenge you, Ron. So one of the things I do, I still listen to Rush Limbaugh about once a week, and the new conservative show is One America. It's got its own network channel, so let's see how much you can listen to in a week.
All right. Well, we'll have
That'll maybe be a New Year's resolution for you.
one of my New Year's resolutions, right? Other things that, if we look back on 2017, I think that, and looking forward to 2018, the Mueller investigation. The investigation into the Russian connections and influence on the 2016 election. Did or did not the Trump administration campaign officials collude with the Russians? What influence did Russia have? The firing of Comey was, of course, one of the most important stories of 2017. It appears that Trump himself admitted that this was to stop the Russian investigation, which is an obstruction of justice admission right off the top of his, you know, right off out of his own mouth. But after Comey gets fired, then of course the special counsel gets appointed. The Mueller investigation has been going on, and you know, what do you think is going to happen with the Mueller investigation in 2018? We know it's one of the biggest stories of 2017, but we don't know what the outcome is going to be of that yet.
Well, Flynn, knowing that he's basically made a deal with Mueller, I think is huge. If I had to make one prediction, I would say that Jared Kushner is next. I think that will soon be coming, but it's such a complicated investigation. It is really hard to say whether that'll even be wrapped up in this next, session year. Much less will it reach Trump by the midterms. And I think a very interesting political question becomes what we lived through in 2016. What does a special investigator or the FBI at that point about emails, right? What do they, if they do know something, do they say that before a midterm, which might bias an electorate again in some other fundamental way? Because I think that timing will actually be very close, and I think Mueller will have some really important decisions to make about what he releases and when he releases in order to try to maybe stay out of the 2018 midterms and let that process take its course. I'm less optimistic we'll reach Trump in the next year, I gotta say. But there is a whole other movement, as you probably well know. There are Democrats pushing for impeachment. Tom Steyer, he's a billionaire who's given more money to support pro-climate change candidates in Congress than probably anybody else. Is leading a huge campaign with other press and First Amendment right folks to impeach Trump. And it's been a very interesting debate, because most of the standard folks in Congress, even your Bernie Sanders, are saying, let Mueller do his job, let's stay out of that, let's let that take its course. But Steyer is leading a whole revolution that says Mueller only is doing a criminal proceedings, and that's great. and here's the 19,000 other lies and offenses that have been told, and someone needs to hold the president accountable for those, and that's what that whole movement is about. And if you think about the political continuum, right, it does sometimes take a little bit on the edge to push things back to the middle. So if we're seeking any type of referendum or accountability by Trump, probably Tom Steyer's movement is the only thing that's going to move it in that direction. I don't think they're going to get impeachment either, though. I'm less hopeful about that happening. So we're in for 3 more years, you know.
Yeah, I don't see impeachment in the offing absent an incredibly damning report from Mueller.
Right.
So if Robert Mueller comes out early in the summer with an exceedingly damning report that indicts people in the Trump administration, that is sent to the Congress, does that put enough pressure? I mean, the only way that triggers impeachment is if Republican senators are convinced, or Republican Congress people are convinced that this is going to jeopardize their position in the 2018 election.
That's right.
So to some extent, I think Mueller could, you know, if the Mueller report comes in the summer, it puts this incredible pressure for the 2018 elections.
Yeah, he's got a lot to think about.
What's Fred Upton going to do? What's Fred Upton going to do if Mueller comes out with this exceedingly damning report and indicts a whole bunch of people and states the case that there's considerable evidence that the President of the United States obstructed justice? What's Fred Upton going to do? Is he going to vote for impeachment? Is he going to take a stand on that issue?
Exactly.
Whoever the Democratic candidate is that emerges out of this very crowded field.
Should have a lot of things to attack their opponent on, that's for sure.
I think that would be something that you would really want to press hard you know, and across the board.
Well, it'll be very difficult because most Republicans have tried to play this sort of neutral game and get what they can through, and the tax bill is probably the only legislative accomplishment of that, but not totally sever ties with Trump either. And so if something like that from the Mueller investigation were to come out at the right time, they'd have a pretty hard time to defend their records and their statements as well over this last year and a half, right? So that to me is the interplay to watch, right? When will those findings, and not just what will they be, but when they'll be released, and how that is going to affect the 2018 midterms. I am sure there are some very good people, smarter than me, thinking about exactly how that might work. But I do think the Democrats are poised to, you know, all signs indicate a wave election. Right, if standard politics can be believed, which is also in question right now, since our misguided beliefs as to how the 2016 election would work out. So there's a lot of seats up, of course, but Democrats
the electoral map doesn't favor the Democrats as much in the Senate this time as Democrats would like it to.
That's right.
But nonetheless, it does appear that there's a kind of a building Democratic wave if any of the the special elections that have been held recently are an indicator
Alabama
of that. So the 2018 elections will be one of the big stories.
I think so.
And how the Mueller investigation affects the 2018 elections, those are 2 things to really keep an eye on for this coming year.
Absolutely.
Along those lines, there's this new book that just came out, Fire and Fury, and what's the guy's name? Michael Wolff is the author, and it's causing an enormous stir right now. It'll actually be released today. As we're taping this program, it's being released this day. It appears to have caused a breakup between Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. Now, I want to ask you as a political scientist to kind of analyze how this plays into the 2018 elections, because if Bannon remains in a powerful position, he was threatening to run extremist candidates against the mainstream Republicans, right? What he considers mainstream Republicans. You and I probably wouldn't consider him too mainstream.
Exactly.
But so he's got this feud with Mitch McConnell. I'm going to take you down, McConnell, and I'm going to run all these candidates against you, you know, Washington insider Republicans, right? Now that's pretty much gone away. Bannon's lost his power. He's lost. The Mercers have pulled all their money from him. They were, you know, the billionaires funding him. These extreme right-wing billionaires funding him. He's lost that money. He's lost his support from Trump, and he might get pushed off out of Breitbart. So if Bannon is unable to really challenge Republicans in the primary, how does that play out? Now, my view is that on the one hand, that if Bannon were successful in getting some of those more extremist candidates nominated, that favors Democrats in the general election.
At this point it does, yes.
But does it also, if it doesn't work that way, does it now free up some of those mainstream Republicans to oppose Trump more strongly because they don't have to fear, they don't have to look over their shoulder at a Bannon extremist coming at them because they're not supporting Trump?
Yeah. Exactly. So we saw a version of this play out with the Tea Party politics, right? And that whole movement, which did work, right? There was an extremist, there was a whole campaign to run right of Republicans in already Republican districts. Fred Upton was an example of that, right? Primary challengers, which moved him more to the right.
Scared Fred to death.
Right. It totally worked for the Republicans, and add the redistricting right after that, right? That was a concerted campaign to make that happen. And I think that's what folks were hoping they were going to be able to do again, and that's what Bannon, like you said, was hoping to make that even more extreme. I think, again, that this year has hopefully taught some folks to be a little careful for what you wish for. And that maybe you don't really want all the fear-mongering to guide your entire district. So I think they'd be very unsuccessful in doing that, but it does sort of break my heart because I think you're right. I think some of the electorate is at a position where that would help a Democrat, right? Well, here's just the really out of line with our cultural values candidate, and if that's even part of the Republican Party, then you know what, maybe we should look over here. What's more interesting, I think, is the corporate interest part of this, and where that, again, if we're going to give corporations much more legal status, much more political status and First Amendment rights, and continue this dark money in politics, they have a lot more power. And I think corporations are starting to realize that they can't also align themselves with the Breitbarts and the far alt-right and even some of Trump's statements because their consumers won't stand for it, right? And there's been some really interesting, quick and dirty research being done about party affiliation and where you shop. And you know, there's still some conservative strongholds of the LL Beans, which I shop there, but that definitely could get away with a little bit more. But it's a very mixed consumer society. And so corporations really have to be very, very careful about their own PR, and they don't want to lose business based on an ideological statement. So this is the one time, Ron, where I might say that corporate capitalism might actually be helpful because they don't want to alienate any buyers. And so that'll be, I think, some research to watch this year to see what where that money does go, and because if people do find out who you're supporting, that can be a very, very bad thing for your business, and that won't stand.
I mean, those corporations have to be looking at the polls. I mean, Trump is an extremely unpopular president. There's never been a first-term president that's been lower in the public opinion polls than Donald Trump. At this point, after 1 year.
That's right.
Now, he does have this very hardcore group of supporters on the right. But nonetheless, that's 35%,
30 to 36% at its
most,
best.
Right?
That's right.
At the best. And so if I'm a corporate executive, do I want to play to Trump in that base, or do I want to look at the larger society that's not in favor of these activities?
So that, again, to me is the more interesting thing to play out and see who these candidates can even get to support them financially in this world. I want to make sure we address the other big story, and they got the cover of Time, right? People of the Year, and the whole Me Too, the really coming of age in a whole new way of the sexual harassment and at every level. And it's interesting to watch those stories play out in the news media and Hollywood. Politics is still its own weird example, right? Of course, is happening, and there are lots of great bills to try to counteract the sexual harassment that goes on within the halls of Congress. But it is different when you're in government, right? If you're a corporate executive or even Hollywood or a news organization, you can just fire that person.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's up to the American public to fire that person, right?
Yeah.
Or to help support a change in those policies. And so, a lot of people have asked me, well, why don't we see the same, but you see people like Franken resigning, but you still see the Roy Moores running and getting support for that. And I do think it's because government is a much different, who's your boss is still so different based on who you are and where you are than any of those other worlds. But the movement we've seen in Hollywood and other industries, I think, has been a big story this year that we can't. I can't leave today without mentioning.
No, I agree. I think it's one of the biggest stories of the year, the Harvey Weinstein case and the fallout from that, the Me Too movement. And then it just seemed like almost every day there was another.
I know, it was like afraid to watch. It was like what icon is going to fall today, right?
Yeah. Even people that we like and admire, like Al Franken, get caught up in this, and then of course Franken has to resign.
That's right.
And so I think this is one of the biggest stories, and in terms of talking about resistance, that I think this has become a movement that can have a political impact. Now, the most glaring issue that's out there with regard to this is Donald Trump.
That's right.
I mean, during the campaign, Trump was revealed as a person who sexually assaulted women, bragged about sexually assaulting women, says he could get away with it because of his power. Said he was going to sue all these women that were making claims against him. Then, of course, he didn't file one single lawsuit. Why is Donald Trump different?
That's right. And
if Al Franken has to resign, given the things that Al Franken was accused of doing, if a Roy Moore was not qualified to become a United States Senator because of the accusations of his involvement, his sexual proclivities with young women, why isn't Donald Trump forced to resign the presidency of the United States? Because he is clearly one of the worst offenders out there.
That's right.
And he has admitted to it.
That's right.
He claims now that all those women were lying, but he admitted on that tape. And all you have to do is keep running that tape over and over and over again. Because he just blatantly admitted it right on tape, on television.
That's right.
And so, again, I think this is an extremely important movement, and it's going to, I think, only grow during the year. But again, one of the big questions is, does this affect Donald Trump in 2018 in a way that it so far has not?
That's right. And timing is everything with these things, right? Because the administration's answer to that is asked and answered. The American public is the boss, right? And they still voted for Trump. They knew what they needed to know, and that we still have a majority. So that's what I mean about it's, in corporate America, you would fire that person. You could never get away with that liability. And this is another one of those political norms that has totally changed and is off the map. Hopefully those Hollywood women with all that money, they're putting together a new organization. Maybe we'll see some new challenges, some attempt to bring that up. But I can't let that go without saying I've been very impressed with that organization and with what Congress is doing, and also trying to fund not just powerful women who can speak out, right, but to fund all sorts of programs are starting to have the ability for legal and therapy and counseling and all sorts of things for women who are underprivileged, right? Because of course this doesn't just happen in Hollywood and the halls of Congress, right? It's happening. So I've been impressed with those women leading those organizations and with their respect for the underprivileged component of that. And one thing that if we look internationally for just a second, there's still 130 million girls, according to the UN's last report, that don't go to school in this world. So education is one of the big routes we know to changing our society. So that's my plug.
It still is a patriarchal society in all kinds of ways, and the challenges are difficult. And the people that have been assaulted or harassed are often in very vulnerable and powerless positions. And so the more political support and cover that can be provided from those powerful women in Hollywood and from supporters in the political arena. I mean, I think it was right for Al Franken to have to resign. I mean, I think it has to be a consistent across the board. If you engage in this kind of behavior, that can't be tolerated. And if it can't be tolerated for Al Franken, it can't be tolerated for Donald Trump.
The pendulum always swings, right? Hopefully, and you know, I'm sure there are gradations and distinctions, and those will be, I hope, future conversations. But yeah, right now it should sort of be anything. Sorry, is all of it. But so, what are your predictions in New Year?
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes.
So I want to make one quick prediction.
Okay.
That's hopefully a fun one. Russia will have an election, and Putin will win.
Wow, you're really going out on a limb there, Denise.
Yeah, I'm like 99% sure on that one.
You think so? That's going to happen, huh? Well,
that was my only prepared prediction, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, my crystal ball is pretty cloudy. As I think we stated during the program, to me, the big stories for 2018 are going to be where does the Mueller investigation go? Do we get a report from the Mueller, the special counsel, at some time during this 2018 year? And the other big story is the 2018 elections, the midterm elections. Can the Democrats recapture the House, maybe the Senate? I think those are possible. I'm not going to predict that those are going to happen.
House
but
seems possible, yes.
But they're in the realm of possibility now, which one wouldn't have anticipated maybe even a year ago. So, and those two stories, of course, as we indicated during the program, can get tied together in a very substantial way. So to me, that's going to be the biggest issue, the two biggest issues.
So since this is recorded, we'll have to check ourselves in a year or 6 months or
we'll
something.
Have to come back. We're on tape as being committed to these things, although we haven't gone too far out on the limb.
I don't think so.
Except you did with that Russian.
There you go, that
thing,
Russian, that's, you know.
We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to point out a couple of things that are coming up in the Kalamazoo area that people might be interested in. On MLK Day, January 15th, there's going to be another teach-in at Western Michigan University. It'll be in the Bernhardt Center from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. Our good friend Alan Webb and the organized West Michigan group have put together an outstanding program. And so again, all day long, various issues concerning...
Ron will be a distinguished speaker.
I'm going to be talking about the Korean situation. I think you're going to be talking about climate change.
A little bit,
So again, on January 15th, MLK Day, and then on January 24th, we're going to have a special visitor to Kalamazoo, William Hartung, who is a specialist, has written a number of books on the military-industrial complex. He's going to be speaking somewhere in Kalamazoo. We don't have a place yet for that, but January 24th, Wednesday evening, William Hartung will be here to talk about the military-industrial complex. And with that, we're done. Again, Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views, and we hope to see you again frequently during this coming year.